Okay, this is discussion 5A, and actually it's the only part of the discussion, so there's no 5B. I talked about the Persian empires here, and I mentioned in that lecture, I talked a little bit about some of the idea of this classical societies in the classical era. And historians, I want to talk a little bit about that era now, and in particular what that means for society and religions. And I talked a little bit about this in the Persian lectures, but I want to make it sort of more general and talk about it in a larger sense. So historians generally call this era from 500 BCE to 500 CE the classical era. And this is because, as I mentioned in the Persian lecture, the empires got much bigger at this time period, and governments got more complex, and society saw a lot of increased trade and social stratification, social classes, etc. And so this era sees a certain type of society. All right. And so I want to just mention, to sort of tie all this together, that, I talked about the Persian empires today. I'm going to talk about Han China shortly. We'll talk about the Greek and Roman empires, the Mauryan and Gupta empires in India. Those are the classical societies. Those are the classical civilizations, the classical empires. And they have a lot in common. Now, each one's different in all sorts of details, but they have a lot of these sort of central functional difficulties, and their solutions are often very similar. And so, I mentioned in the Persian lecture that, the difficulties are, how do you communicate over large distances? How do you hold together all these multiple different ethnic groups? How do you have a government to keep track of everything? And the solutions are often very similar also, in that you build roads and you develop a good writing system, and then you develop a bureaucracy that keeps track of things. You develop taxation, you develop a standardized currency. There's all sorts of things that you can do that handle these problems. And because these are sort of standard problems, these empires come up with the same solution over and over again, not because they're necessarily copying each other, but because those are the most obvious and best solutions for these problems. So when you're looking at all these different empires, I want you to keep asking yourself, how does this compare to, Persia or Han China? How does this compare? And look for the similarities, and then ask yourself, are these similarities because it's just a good solution to the same problem, or is there something deeper here? Or look at the differences. Why did this region come up with something different when the others all came up with the standard answer, so to speak? One thing I want to mention about this is that these classical societies often grew as empires through what we might call growth as self-defense. And what happens is that essentially, if you have a fairly wealthy, settled agricultural society, you start generating lots of wealth, and you start attracting people who want to attack that, right? People who want that wealth. And so in particular, nomadic and pastoralist groups will start to come into a civilization to try to plunder it or to get a hold of that wealth. Well, in order to defend yourself, you can just keep waiting for them to keep attacking, or eventually you'll say, well, heck, I'm just going to go conquer them, right? Because that's the easiest way to handle them, is once I conquer them, then they pay me taxes and stuff, and they don't attack me anymore. Well, that's a good solution for an empire. You conquer the people who are attacking you. But then once you've conquered them, there's another group beyond that who wants to attack you, et cetera, et cetera. And so you can see how these empires start to grow, and every time they conquer a new territory or a new group of people, because they're developing these tax systems and things, they're pretty good at getting resources out of that group and using those resources to attack the next group, right? Or to conquer the next chunk of territory. So it becomes a virtuous cycle, so to speak. The more territory they conquer, the more they're able to conquer more territory. And this is how you build an empire, so to speak. So when we're looking at these classical societies, they will all obviously be different, and I'll mention all sorts of different things. In particular, the religions are very different. But I want you to focus also on the similarities. Right? Focus on the similarities, and look at the class structures, look at the government structures, look at things like the roads and the money, but also look at things like gender roles. We're going to be talking about gender roles later in the semester, and there are a lot of similarities there. And you might ask yourself, are these gender roles in some way an adaptation to the circumstances that these larger societies find themselves in? Now, I want to turn to a particular topic here, which has to do very much with these classical civilizations. We're going to see a whole slew of religions emerge during this classical era from 500 BCE to 500 CE. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, Jainism, Manichaeanism. And then we'll also see two social philosophies that emerge, Confucianism and Greek individualism, which also are in many ways similar to these religions. And what they all have in common, I mean, aside from the fact that they all emerged during the classical era, what they all have in common is that these are religions that are focused on individual behavior, right? These are religions that focus on, as an individual, how should you live your life? What is morality? And then they often ask, not always, but they often ask a larger question, which is, what's the meaning of life? What does it all mean? What happens after we die? And so a lot of these religions are actually what we would call salvation religions, which means that they talk about how to live your life now as part of a larger process of getting into heaven or getting into nirvana or salvation, etc. And so they actually envision a larger process that goes on beyond life and death that you're part of. Okay, so these classical religions are all really focused on personal morality. How should I act? Each individual should be asking, how should I act? How do I make sense of life? What's the meaning of life? But also, what happens after I die, right? And so these religions, as they emerge, we're really going to be looking at them closely. And there's a couple of things that I really want you to be thinking about. I mean, first of all, I want you to look at these religions and say, are they influencing each other? And we'll see that there are a number of religions that are clearly influenced by other religions, right? But also, I want you to be thinking about what's the impact of this religion on the society. And normally when we think of religion, we think of it in terms of, is that right or wrong? I was taught this. What's the truth? What's God really want? But historians ask different questions about religions. What historians will say is, what's the impact? If a lot of people practice this religion, what's the impact on society, right? And just an example, if you look at the New Testament, a lot of the teachings of Jesus are about nonviolence, turn the other cheek, etc. Well, what if a whole society actually practiced that, right? What would that do to society? Would they get conquered? Would that be a radically new version of society? Those are the kind of questions I want you to ask. And in particular, we're going to be reading the Bhagavad Gita, and I'll talk in tomorrow, or on rather Friday's discussion about the Bhagavad Gita, just to give you some idea of what you're reading and what you should be looking for. But one of the questions we're going to be asking is, how does Hinduism and the idea of caste system in Hinduism shape Indian society, right? What happens if everybody in society is Hindu? What's the result of that, right? So historians are much more focused. We're not going to weigh in on whether a religion is true or not in the sense of, does God really want this? Is there really a God? Is there really a heaven? Historians don't have any answers for that. All we know about is this world and history. So what we're going to be asking about religions is, what's the effect of this religion on society and history? How did it change people's behaviors if they believed this religion? And what was the impact of that in the course of history? Right? So I want you to be thinking about those things. Now, in particular terms, in these classical societies, I talked quite a bit about how these new classical societies are bigger, right? They're geographically bigger. They have much bigger populations. But they also are multicultural, right? And they have a lot of trade, and they have much bigger governments. And that means in general that they have bigger cities, because cities are where people gather for trade, and cities are where government officials live, and soldiers and merchants and artisans and things like that. And so the more a society generates excess wealth that can be used to fund government and conquest and armies and things, the more you start to see big cities emerging, because a bigger portion of the population is not being farmers. They're actually being government officials and merchants and artisans and soldiers and things like that. And so one of the things to keep in mind is these classical societies, for the first time, not for the first time, but it's sort of they have a quantum leap in terms of people's worldview, right? I mean, you think about ancient Sumeria, they had the first cities, but really that city was just, Uruk controlled the territory of maybe 50 square miles or something like that. So their world was pretty small. They knew about the next city over, Kish or Lagash or Eridu or something. but they really didn't know much about what was going on in Harappa, et cetera. Trade was pretty, trade existed. We have evidence of that from Harappa, for instance, but it was not a very big part of the economy. Well, in classical societies, trade starts to become a bigger part of the economy. It's still luxury goods for the most part. People aren't, ordering, grain from thousands of miles away. But trade starts to become a common thing, and people's worldview starts to their sense of the world, their horizons begin to expand as they're aware of what's happening. The government knows what's happening both in Pakistan and Egypt at the same time, right? And so government officials are aware of this, and so this causes changes in society. You start to have a merchant class which travels regularly all over the place. You start to have artisans who are making stuff knowing that their stuff is going to be sold, hundreds of miles away. You have people are buying stuff that they know came from hundreds of miles away, and they start to have categories in their heads like this is what Egyptian cotton feels like or something like that. So people start to have expanded worldviews. But also, with all this trade and all these multicultural societies, people start having to deal with people who are different than them, right? They start having to deal with people who speak different languages and practice different religions and wear different kinds of clothing and come from far away. And so these classical societies start to see a much more what you might call anonymous society. Whereas in Eridu or Lagash or something in ancient Sumeria, you're dealing with pretty much the same people most of the time, right? It's not that big a world. But when you're in the Achaemenid Empire, you might in one day meet Egyptians and Persians and people from India and Greeks and whatever. This is a different world you're living in. And one of the things that these classical religions do is by focusing on individual morality, they allow the society to function because each individual person is sort of regulating their own behavior according to their religion. Before, without that religion, people behave because they're afraid of being punished, right? But with that religion, they behave because they're afraid. That's what God wants them to do, right? And so historians have noted that one of the aspects of these religions of personal morality is that they become good ways for society to regulate behavior when there's too many people meeting each other that don't share a common culture. But if they all have religions that tell them to be good, they're all going to functionally be good, or more of them will be. And so the religions often have a function of allowing a larger society to keep operating smoothly, right? Because the religion puts the burden on each individual to act in a good way, and not just because they're being told to. And so these religions allow for a larger society to even function. Now, you might ask, well, how did this come about? I mean, if that's what these religions are doing, how did that happen? Well, you could say, well, first of all, maybe the religions were developed by a few priests and elites who wanted to force, they saw, we can govern a larger society if we can get everyone to believe God wants them to behave themselves. So the religion is essentially a sort of a propaganda by the elites pushed on them to get everybody to behave themselves. You can't discount that entirely, but it seems a little too conspiracy theorish. The second possibility is that people, as the society grew and people started to encounter people who had different customs and things, they began to feel a sense of, I want to know what the rules are. I want some sense of how I'm supposed to act. I want some sense, everybody around me is acting all these different ways and they've got different customs and traditions. What's right? And these religions appear as an answer to this need that people have to have a larger sense of here's what's right and here's what's wrong and here's how we're supposed to act. And so the religions satisfy a sort of a personal need, and they spread precisely because many people have the same need because they're all living in this same more cosmopolitan society. So it appears organically that way. One other possibility, a third possibility, is that perhaps there's some sort of, for lack of a better word, a Darwinian evolution going on here. That in Darwinian evolution, animals that are better adapted survive and those that are badly adapted go extinct. Well, maybe societies that develop these religions are successful and build big empires, and they gobble up societies that don't have these religions, and so they don't operate as well. So it's possible that it's simply that societies that develop religions like this are better able to operate in the world, and so they succeed and create big empires and big prosperous societies, and societies that don't develop these religions either get conquered by one that did develop that religion, or they simply don't flourish, right? It could be all three of those things. It could be that people genuinely embrace these religions because they answered questions that people were all feeling as these societies developed, trade and more cosmopolitanism. It could be that there was a Darwinian selection process, that the societies that adopted these religions succeeded and the societies that didn't failed. And it could also be that once these religions started to spread, elites and government officials said, hey, this is really helpful. We're going to push this. We're going to promote this because it's really helpful for us if everyone practices this religion and is on the same page. So it could be any of those three factors. It could be all three of those factors. It could be some mix in the case of every civilization. But I want you to be asking yourself as we go through the next several weeks with the different, Han China and the Greeks and Romans and the Indian empires, ask yourself, how is the religion mixing with the formation of the societies, and what's the impact of this religion on a society, and what's the impact of that religion on a society? How would this religion help a society to maintain order? How would this religion maybe undermine the society or make the society work less well? So I want you to be thinking about religions as a social influence rather than as something right or wrong, okay? So that is discussion 5A.